High above the blazing streets of Ouagadougou, the engines of the presidential jet rumbled as the final security checks were underway. The sun was already climbing, casting a golden sheen over the city, as Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, reviewed the final itinerary from his chief aide, Mamadou Cissé. "Are we clear on the route?" Traoré asked, tightening his military-styled cuffs. "Yes, sir," Mamadou replied confidently. "We'll take the Atlantic corridor, avoid known NATO tracking paths, and stay in constant contact with the Russian embassy." Traoré gave a slow nod. The air was thick with significance. This was no ordinary flight. He wasn't just visiting Moscow for a military parade. He was walking into history with every step toward that aircraft. For months, Burkina Faso had distanced itself from Western alliances. Traoré's unwavering stance for national sovereignty had made headlines and enemies. The West had grown tense with every trade deal he signed with the Kremlin and every speech he made about African independence. The message was clear. Africa was reclaiming its place, and that made him a threat. As he approached the aircraft, flanked by his new security chief, Fatou Diallo, Traoré paused. The tarmac, normally alive with chattering crews and mechanics, was eerily silent. It wasn't fear, it was respect, and perhaps a touch of fear. "Madame Diallo," he said, not turning his head, "keep your eyes sharp. I expect a move. Something theatrical." Diallo didn't smile. She adjusted the strap of her firearm and gave a sharp nod. "Yes, Mr. President." Inside the aircraft, co-pilots Lieutenant Bernard Cafando and Captain Theo Mambe were already in their seats, checking navigation routes. The air crew, led by steward Yassine Tapsoba, completed the final boarding protocol. The jet was scheduled to cross into international airspace by mid-afternoon and enter the Russian communication zone by early evening. Traoré settled into his seat, glancing at the briefing packet on NATO flight activities. He circled a small region near the Azores Island. "This is where they'll try something," he muttered. The engines roared to life. Ouagadougou slowly vanished beneath the clouds as the aircraft climbed. Below, millions of Burkinabe citizens went about their day, unaware of the storm building miles above their sky. Hours into the flight, with the presidential jet gliding over the Atlantic, Mamadou Cissé returned to the main cabin. His face was unusually pale. "Mr. President," he whispered, "something's on the radar." Traoré's eyes sharpened. He turned to the cockpit, where Captain Mambe confirmed it. "Unidentified objects moving fast, closing in from the northwest. Likely military jets. Can you identify?" "Preliminary signature. American, possibly French too." The tension thickened. Within minutes, 2 fighter jets appeared in visual range, flanking both sides of the aircraft. They didn't fire, but their message was clear. This was no friendly escort. A static-laced message broke through the comms system. "This is a restricted air court. Land immediately or face interception." "Repeat, land immediately." Everyone on board froze, except Ibrahim Traoré. He stood up slowly, walking toward the cockpit door, gazing through the reinforced glass toward the sea of blue sky. Then calmly, he said, "Continue on course. Do not respond. Let them make the first move." Yassine Tapsoba clenched the metal handrail near his seat. "Sir, if they fire, they won't," Traoré replied coldly. "Not unless they're ready for a war they can't win." Meanwhile, across a secure NATO channel, U.S. Colonel Diane Whitaker barked orders into her headset from an air command base in Spain. "Confirm visual contact with Traoré's jet. Stand by for orders. We don't fire unless fired upon." But the atmosphere in the NATO control room was tense. What was supposed to be a political pressure tactic had suddenly evolved into a high-stakes standoff over international waters. Back aboard the presidential jet, the radar lit up again. This time, the signal was different. Larger, moving faster. Fatou Diallo's hand moved to her pistol instinctively, even though it was useless in the sky. "New contact approaching from the northeast," Bernard Cafando called out. Everyone waited. A beat, then another, then the sonic boom shattered the tension. 4 sleek fighter jets burst through the clouds. Russian Su-35s. They didn't waste time. Within seconds, they moved into formation alongside Traore's plane, clearly positioning themselves between the Western aircraft and the presidential jet. Russian Air Command to NATO aircraft. A voice crackled through the shared channel. You are interfering with the sovereign diplomatic mission. Disengage immediately, or we will respond. The sky had turned into a chessboard. In the silence that followed, no one dared to breathe. Inside the aircraft, Traore returned to his seat, breathing evenly. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. We will finish what we started, he said quietly. And as the aircraft pressed forward toward Moscow, the balance of global power tilted slightly, silently, but unmistakably. The air inside the cockpit was thick with tension. Captain Minbei's fingers hovered just above the communication controls, waiting for instructions he hoped wouldn't come. On the radar, the standoff was crystal clear. 2 American F-22s, 1 French Rafale, and 4 Russian Su-35s, all circling within lethal proximity. They're holding, Minbei muttered. But one wrong move. President Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. He sat stone still, listening to the silent symphony of power projected above the Atlantic Ocean. His mind wasn't on the planes. It was on what this moment represented. Fatou Diallo stepped into the cockpit, her voice low and urgent. Sir, a second NATO communication has come through. Encrypted. They're asking for a secure line to speak directly with you. Let it through, Traoré replied. The cockpit went quiet as Minbei routed the signal to a secure headset. Traoré placed it over his ears and waited. The line clicked, then crackled. Ibrahim came a familiar voice. American, smooth, calculated. This is Ambassador Charles Whitman. You know why we're here. I'm listening, Traoré said coolly. You are compromising airspace stability. This flight, this show of defiance, will have consequences. Turn around, we'll allow you to land safely in Lisbon. No harm, no escalation. Is that a threat? It's a solution. The West has been patient with your alignments. But there are lines, Ibrahim, today. You're about to cross them. Traoré leaned back, one hand stroking the edge of his seat. Then let me make it clear, Charles. I don't respond to intimidation. Not on the ground, and certainly not in the sky. A pause. You know what you're risking, Whitman warned. I know exactly what I'm risking. That's why I'm doing it. Traoré removed the headset and handed it to Fatou without another word. On the other side of the globe, inside a windowless control room buried beneath the Pentagon, Charles Whitman tossed his own headset onto the table. Around him, military advisors and intelligence chiefs exchanged tense glances. The president of Burkina Faso had just brushed off a direct diplomatic warning from the United States. How far do we let this go? Asked General Marvin Ellison, head of Joint Command Operation. Whitman didn't answer right away. If we shoot down his plane, we risk a global incident with Russia. If we let him through, we look weak. Ellison's voice dropped. And if we force him down, jam the comms, scramble his guidance, fake a technical failure, Whitman closed his eyes. He's already outplayed us. He brought Russian air cover. In international airspace, he came prepared. Whatever we do next will define us. Back in the sky, the formation of jets continued their slow, tense ballet. Traoré's aircraft held its course, escorted now by the Russian fighters in full lockstep. Each second stretched like an hour. Everyone on board could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. Mamadou Cissé paced the cabin restlessly. President, if I may, this is getting too dangerous. You've made your point. We could still divert, land safely, and avoid conflict. No, Traoré replied without emotion. If we divert now, we reinforce their illusion that Africa still takes order, that its leaders can be spooked into obedience, that our skies are not our own. He stood and walked to the cabin's small window, gazing out at the F-22s, still hovering to the west. I'd rather fall from the sky, he murmured, than descend in shame. Down below, far beneath the circling jets, a Russian nuclear submarine, the Rybalkin, silently tracked the incident. Inside the command center, Captain Viktor Morozov listened to encrypted comms as updates filtered in. Moscow had issued no official orders yet, but the unspoken rule was clear: protect the asset. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Sasha Belikov, spoke cautiously. Sir, if this escalates, we'll be called to surface. Possibly launch support protocols. Morozov nodded. Then pray it doesn't escalate. At that moment, in the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin was being briefed in real time, seated in a high-security briefing room with Russia's Minister of Defense and top air command officials. He stared at the projection of the flight path. He tapped the table twice. Send word to the Americans, he said. We are treating this as an act of interference. If they breach the 30-kilometer defense zone around our escort, we will respond. His voice was calm but final. Back in the skies, the radio crackled again. This time from the French side. This is Commander Louis Barre, French Air Force. We request immediate communication with the pilot of the aircraft carrying President Traoré. Captain Mabe looked at Traoré. He nodded. You have the line, Commander. Mabe responded. There was a pause. Then, in a voice stripped of threat but heavy with tension, Barre said, Mr. President, we are not here to fight you, but understand, your presence in this corridor represents more than politics. It represents defiance. That defiance could spiral beyond your control. Traoré took the mic himself. Commander Barre, I appreciate your professionalism, but history has taught us something in Africa. When we wait for permission, we get colonized. When we ask for respect, we're ignored. So today, we are flying with those who respect our choice, not those who try to shape it. There was silence, and then Barre's voice returned, quiet, almost human. Bonne chance, Monsieur le Président. With that, the French jets began to pull away, one by one, disengaging. The American fighters hovered a moment longer, then retreated into the clouds. Inside Traoré's jet, the tension shattered into stunned silence. Captain Mabe turned to face the cabin. They're gone. Traoré let out a breath. But he wasn't smiling. We may have won this round, he said, but the real storm is still coming. The sky ahead was open now. No foreign jets, no hostile voices on the comms. Just the faint sound of Russian fighters in formation and the steady hum of the engines as the presidential jet coasted toward Russian airspace. But President Ibrahim Traoré wasn't resting. He sat quietly, fingers laced beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the flight tracker, as a crimson line slowly arched across digital skies. Fatou Diallo broke the silence. ETA to Moscow, 95 minutes, Mr. President. Keep our altitude. Let them know we're not hiding. Traoré replied without lifting his gaze. Mamadou Cissé, seated across the aisle, leaned forward with a cautious breath. We've passed the hardest part, haven't we? Traoré looked at him, expression unreadable. No, we've just passed the most obvious part. Below them, the landscape of Eastern Europe began to unfold. Forests and mountains, rivers glinting beneath scattered clouds. The kind of beauty that masked borders, missile sites, intelligence outposts. The kind of land where alliances were made and betrayed. In the Kremlin, the Situation Room was still alive with motion. President Putin, now seated more casually, lit a cigarette as one of his advisors whispered in his ear. They backed off, just as we predicted. The advisor said, Traoré's flight is entering Russian monitoring range. Putin nodded slowly. The Americans don't want a war, not over Burkina Faso. But even as the words left his lips, he knew better. It wasn't about Burkina Faso. It was about what it represented. A sovereign African state choosing to forge a new alliance without permission. That had always been the red line. Back aboard the aircraft, the mood shifted slightly. The crew began preparing for descent. The flight path would now thread through Belarusian air corridors before dipping toward Moscow. Everything was going according to plan. Until it was. Captain Maningvei's voice cut through the intercom. Unidentified drone signature approaching. Multiple, small, fast. Fatou was already on her feet, heading for the cockpit. How many? 4, possibly 6. Flying in from the southeast, no IFF signals. Could be recon or worse. Mamadou stood as well, his voice strained. Could it be NATO again? No, Traoré said softly. Standing, it's someone else now. The threat had shifted. Suddenly, one of the Russian escort jets broke formation, diving sharply toward the incoming drones. The comms crackled. Shu-35. Engaging. No response from targets. Preparing countermeasures. And then came the distant bloom of explosions. 2 drones vanished from the radar instantly. The plane jolted slightly from the shock waves. Maming Bey cursed under his breath. They were armed. Futu turned to Traore. Sir, we need permission to divert. We can reroute through Kazan, lower our profile. No, Traore interrupted. We go to Moscow as planned. We don't duck, we don't change. But sir, no. The tone left no room for argument. On the ground in Moscow, Vnukovo International Airport was already sealed off. Russian ground crews and special forces lined the tarmac, scanning the skies. In a secure motorcade, Foreign Minister Irina Volkova checked her watch. Her orders were clear. Receive Traore with full honors, no matter the fallout. And yet, even she knew this visit had already rewritten the playbook of diplomacy. Back in the sky, the drone threat had dissipated. 2 were downed, 2 more disappeared off radar, likely having aborted. But the message was clear. Someone had tried to sabotage the arrival. Captain Mamgay adjusted his earpiece. Descending now, final approach. Inside the cabin, silence fell once again. Traore stared at the skyline as the spires and towers of Moscow emerged through the clouds. Mamadou leaned in. Do you think it was mercenaries? Or someone inside NATO working off the books? Traore's reply was quiet. Whoever it was, they feared the landing more than the journey. As the wheels of the plane kissed the tarmac, the crew broke into scattered applause. Futu closed her eyes for 1 second, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the past hour. Traore didn't move. His posture remained upright, composed. The cabin door opened with a hiss. The Russian honor guard stood in formation outside, flags held high, sabers gleaming. Beyond them stood Irina Volkova, flanked by Kremlin security. Traore stepped out into the cold Moscow air, not as a guest, but as a statement. Volkova offered her hand. Welcome to Moscow, President Traore. The Kremlin awaits. He shook her hand firmly. Then let us begin. Cameras clicked. Flashbulbs fired. But there were no speeches. No formal greetings. Every second counted now. As Traore entered the armored convoy waiting on the runway, Futu slid in beside him, scanning the crowd with razor precision. You know this was just the first test, she said quietly. Yes, he replied, eyes distant. Now comes the real war, the one without bullets. The convoy rolled through the icy streets of Moscow past barricades and checkpoints. Traore's arrival had triggered heightened security across the capital, not because he was a threat, but because of what might follow him. Inside the Kremlin, President Putin waited in his private reception hall. The fire crackled. Tea had been poured, but no music played. No television broadcast. This was a meeting behind closed doors for now. When Traore entered, the 2 men didn't speak at first. They simply stood, face to face. Then a nod. You came through the fire, Putin said. They tried to stop you. They failed, Traore replied. And now we build. Putin raised a glass. To the future, Mr. President. But as their glasses clinked, the storm brewing beyond the Russian snow was just beginning to reach its full force. Unseen, unspoken, but very much alive. Within the grand walls of the Kremlin, President Ibrahim Traoré found himself standing in the shadow of history. The room was lined with portraits of czars and revolutionaries, rulers who had shaped the course of empires. Now, a leader from West Africa stood among them, not as a visitor but as a force rewriting the rules. President Putin leaned forward, fingers steepled. The world will react. Ibrahim, you didn't just land in Moscow. You landed on their pride. Traoré's tone was composed. Good, let them feel what we've felt for centuries. Putin gave a cold smile. You speak like a man who knows he's already won. I haven't won anything yet, but I've made it clear, Africa is done asking permission. Across the room, Irina Volkova handed Traoré a folder. Inside were satellite photos, intercepted transmissions, and drone schematics. This is your welcome gift, she said. The drones weren't NATO standard. They were custom builds, unmarked, likely PMC, private military contractors. American? Fatou Diallo asked from behind. Volkova nodded. Or French, possibly both. The model has been used in Libya, Mali, and Ukraine. Mamadou Cissé cursed under his breath. So they tried to deny it wasn't them, and used mercenaries instead. Putin closed the file. This is the new war, gentlemen. Quiet, deniable, and effective. Unless you're willing to expose it. Traore stood. Then we expose it. Volkova tilted her head. That could start something much bigger. So be it. Later that evening, a small private press room in the Kremlin was prepped under extreme secrecy. No media, no photographers, just a secure camera feed and a broadcast team that reported directly to the Russian Ministry of Information. Traore stood before a plain black background. No flags, no symbols. He spoke directly to the camera, to the people of the world, especially my brothers and sisters across Africa. Today, I speak not as a guest in Moscow, but as a free man, a free African. His voice was calm but unwavering. This journey was never just a flight. It was a challenge. They told me I couldn't come. They tried to stop me in the air, in the shadows, with silence, with violence. But here I am. Fatou and Mamadou watched from the side, both motionless. They fear an Africa that stands. An Africa that thinks for itself, an Africa that chooses its own friends, not the ones handed to us by our former masters. He paused. Let me be clear. Burkina Faso is not anti-West. We are pro-dignity, pro-choice, pro-sovereignty. Outside the Kremlin, as the message was broadcast across closed channels and encrypted African news streams, reactions began erupting across the continent. In Senegal, crowds gathered in front of embassy buildings with flags. In South Africa, opposition leaders quoted Traore's words in parliament. In Mali, his face flashed across giant screens in the capital. In Paris and Washington, however, rooms went quiet. In the State Department, Ambassador Whitman watched the feed in silence, jaw clenched. He's going public. One of his aides asked, "Do we respond?" "No," Whitman snapped. "Not yet. Let it burn a little, then we'll call it propaganda." In a nondescript building in Paris, French intelligence officers watched. One of them, a gray-haired man named Julien Marceau, clicked his pen thoughtfully. "I underestimated him," Marceau admitted. "This isn't just a visit, it's a revolution." Back in the Kremlin, the speech ended. Traore turned from the camera, expression solemn. He wasn't smiling. He hadn't smiled once since he stepped off the plane. Putin approached him slowly. That was not diplomacy. That was a declaration. Traore didn't blink. Diplomacy was what failed us. They walked together toward a long oak table where agreements were waiting to be signed. Not flashy ceremonies, just ink and steel. Agreements on security, energy, trade, cyber defense, and the unspoken one, mutual defense, if needed. As Traore signed, Volkova added another file to the table. "We have eyes on a NATO meeting scheduled in Berlin. Word is your name is on the agenda." "Let them talk," Traore said, not looking up, but in truth, he knew what was coming. Fatou pulled him aside after the signing. "Sir, our intelligence back home says pressure is building. The West is freezing accounts tied to our trade routes. Sanctions might be incoming." "I expected worse," Traore said. "They could squeeze our economy. They've done that for decades, Fatou. Let them try." But the truth gnawed at him. His people had already suffered. Could they endure another storm? Mamadou stepped in. "We need to prepare for retaliation. Financial, political, maybe even covert." "We already are," Traore replied. "Starting tomorrow, I want to speak with China, India, Brazil, build a new supply chain, bypass the old masters." "And the people?" Mamadou asked. "What do we tell them if the markets crash? If fuel prices spike? We tell them the truth, that freedom isn't free." That night, in a secured Kremlin suite, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone for the first time since the journey began. He opened a notebook and wrote, not for policy, but for himself. "They tried to break us in the air. They tried to sabotage us in silence. But we landed. and the world felt it. He closed the notebook and looked out the window. Snow was falling over Moscow, soft and relentless. In the cold, he saw fire. Snow still covered Moscow's rooftops as dawn broke. The final day of President Ibrahim Traoré's visit had arrived. But while the official schedule included a military parade and trade talks, everyone inside the Kremlin knew the real event had already happened. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, where history had quietly shifted its course. Fatou Diallo stood at the balcony of the guest residence, scanning the skyline. Her earpiece crackled. "Security sweep complete," said a voice from the Russian team. "No irregularities." But she didn't lower her guard. Inside, Traoré adjusted the collar of his ceremonial coat, a deep blue jacket embroidered with gold leaves, tailored by a Burkinabe artisan. He looked into the mirror. His face was calm, but not untouched. There was fatigue in his eyes, not of fear but of the weight he now carried. Mamadou entered with a soft knock. "It's time, Mr. President." They descended the marble staircase together. Outside, a convoy of Russian armored cars waited. Traoré climbed in silently, flanked by Fatou and Mamadou, the chill in the air biting but invigorating. The motorcade snaked through Moscow's wide boulevards, past rows of citizens waving small flags, some Russian, some newly printed with the crest of Burkina Faso. He saw a boy holding both in one hand, beaming. "We're not just guests anymore," Traoré murmured. "We're partners." Red Square loomed ahead. Tanks stood idle for display, their barrels wrapped in ceremonial cloth. Soldiers in precision lines awaited the start of the anniversary parade, commemorating the defeat of Nazi Germany, a symbol of resistance, victory, and unity. But all eyes weren't on the tanks. They were on the African president, who had braved international threats to stand beside one of the world's most formidable leaders. As Traoré exited the vehicle, a voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Now arriving, President of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré." He stepped forward. The crowd erupted. President Putin stood at the edge of the viewing platform. No fanfare, no hand extended, just a nod. Traoré nodded back. They stood side by side, silently watching as the procession began. Rows of soldiers marched. Planes thundered overhead. War machines from different eras passed below them like ghosts of history. But Traoré's focus wasn't on the spectacle. It was on the moment. "You know what this means," Putin said without turning. "You're the first African leader to attend this parade since the Cold War. Then let it be the start of something new." Putin smiled faintly. "They won't take it lightly. I don't expect them to." As the last wave of troops passed, a quiet aide approached with a tablet. He whispered something to Volkova, who quickly stepped to Traoré's side. "Mr. President," she said, "we've just intercepted chatter. Multiple cyber attacks targeting banks in Ouagadougou. Coordinated, likely state-sponsored. They're hitting your reserves." Mamadou swore under his breath. "They're not done with you," Fatou said. "I never thought they were," Traoré replied. "Call the Ministry of Finance. Lock foreign accounts. Pull everything into domestic control. Start moving reserves through the new Eastern banking lines." Putin raised an eyebrow. "You've prepared for this?" "Of course, Traoré. This flight began long before I boarded that plane." That evening, back inside the Kremlin, Traoré stood in front of a room filled with diplomats from across Africa and Asia. Delegates from Algeria, South Africa, Vietnam, Brazil, India. The energy was different now. Charged, purposeful. "I did not come here to choose sides," he began. "I came to say we no longer have to accept the sides chosen for us." The room fell silent. For too long, Africa has been told who to trade with, how to govern, when to speak. Today, we reject that script. We are not a pawn in a great game. We are a player, a sovereign force. He paused. "If they punish us with sanctions, we respond with innovation. If they isolate us, we unite. If they threaten our skies, we fly anyway." Applause broke out, not polite but thunderous. After the speech, as the room broke into clusters of conversation, Traoré stood at the edge of the chamber, looking out through the tall windows at the Moscow skyline. Fatou joined him. "Sir," she said quietly, "we've just received confirmation. The African Union wants an emergency summit. in Ouagadougou. You'll be hosting. Traore didn't respond at first. Then he smiled, a rare, slow smile that crept across his face like sunlight returning after storm clouds. Then it begins. 2 days later, his jet lifted off once more, this time from Vnukovo International Airport. Russian fighters flanked him for the first hour, a gesture of respect, not necessity. There were no intercepts, no threats, just open sky. As the Burkinabe jet descended toward home, the capital sparkled in the distance. Crowds had already gathered, banners hung from balconies, children waved flags, and behind them a statue was being unveiled, hastily constructed in those 2 days. It was of a plane, not a warplane, but a passenger jet, with the words carved below, "We fly anyway." Traore's voice broke over the intercom as the wheels prepared to touch down. "To my brothers and sisters of Burkina Faso, I return not alone, but with a voice that was heard across the sky. They tried to stop us, they tried to erase us, but today, we return stronger." The wheels struck tarmac, the brakes hissed, the aircraft came to a gentle halt, and for the first time in decades, a standing ovation awaited a returning African leader, not for submission, but for resistance. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stairs and looked out over his people, he understood. It had not just been a flight, not just a mission. It had been a line in the sky, and they had crossed it together.